Hi, like and subscribe for the more true horror stories.
Story 1. I recently bought a house in the country. I wouldn't quite call it a country estate, but if someone else did, I wouldn't disagree with them either. The house covers a few thousand square feet, and it's on 25 acres of land. Honestly, it's a much bigger house than I'd ever expected to be able to buy, but the sellers had it on the market for dirt cheap. I almost didn't go to look at it. Similar houses were selling for 20 to 30% more, so I figured that there had to be something majorly wrong with this. Like, tear up the foundation level wrong. But my wife Carmen loved the photos, so off we went with the realtor to check out this house. I was convinced we were going to waste our time, but I know when to pick my battles. Obviously, I was wrong. I scrutinized that house too, looking for any signs of rot, any sagging floors or cracks in the walls, any hint of leaning or off-kilter settling. Finally, I gave up and asked the realtor point blank, "What's wrong with this place?" Carmen smacked me in the arm, but the realtor just shrugged. "Honestly, you've got me." I suggested a much higher price, but the seller was insistent that it be sold for the same price he'd bought it for. He said he was taking no piece of it with him. There was a brief silence as we all considered this slightly ominous statement, and then the realtor continued brightly, which also means that this house comes furnished. All of the fixtures and furniture you see here convey. It's ready to move into today. I wanted to go home and think about it, maybe do some more research, see what I could find out. But Carmen made it clear that she was not leaving that house until we put an offer down on it, and I was pretty sure that she meant that literally. So I sighed, read the paperwork thoroughly to make sure that we could back out without penalty if the inspection turned up anything wrong, and signed my name at the end. Carmen was giddy. The kids were thrilled when they got home and found out. And while they made plans about who got what room and what would go where, I resigned myself to being the bad guy when we inevitably found whatever the major problem was, and I had to tell them that we weren't getting the house after all. But the inspector gave it a clean bill of health. The mortgage paperwork all sailed through smoothly, and in only a few weeks, the realtor was handing us the keys and telling us to enjoy our new house. The kids ran screaming through the hallways, shouting joyful challenges to each other, while Carmen and I stood in the foyer and gazed around at our magnificent new house. "It's everything I ever wanted," Carmen told me. "It's perfect." "I hope so," I responded. "We just signed on to 30 years of debt for this." "Curmudgeon," she said, but kissed me anyway. The place really was amazing. It was almost 3 times the amount of space we'd had before. The furnishings were an immense upgrade over our previous IKEA furniture. It had rooms that I'd never had to have names for before. A great room, a cloakroom, a Florida room. Our apartment had had 3 bedrooms, an eat-in kitchen, and a family room. This was like entering an entirely new life. The great room had a huge fireplace, almost as tall as the kids. A thick oak mantel overtopped it, and above that hung a large oil painting of the house. It was beautifully done, with surprising depth and a sense of realism despite the somewhat impressionistic nature of the painting. Ordinarily, I would say that having someone paint a house's portrait was odd, but this picture truly was amazing, and it fit the room perfectly. Besides, what were we going to put up there? The biggest of our pictures was an 8 inches by 10. So we moved in, settled down, and adjusted to our new lives. The house was wonderful, the land was fantastic, and basically everything was perfect. Until one night a few weeks ago when I came downstairs in the middle of the night to raid the fridge. The stairs led into the great room, so I passed through there on my way to the kitchen. I glanced up at the portrait as I walked by and stopped dead in my tracks. The picture of the house was gone, not the painting itself, mind you. That was still hanging where it always had, surrounded by its heavy gilded frame. But instead of showing a picture of the outside of the house, it depicted a darkened interior room which I recognized as my kitchen. Although the room was mostly in shadow, deep crimson splashes made it clear that something horrific had happened in there. and most of the right side of the picture was taken up by a man in a pinstripe suit, a hat shadowing his face so that the only visible feature was his menacing leer, his teeth a blinding white in counterpoint to the shadow. The little I could see of his face was spattered in blood, and he held a gory cleaver up to his chin as if he was thinking about licking it. I immediately turned on the lights, half expecting the picture to revert back to its standard image of the house, but it remained exactly as I'd seen it. I crept closer, the man's grin becoming even more unsettling as I closed the distance. Finally, I stood at the edge of the fireplace and reached up to hesitantly place my hand on the painting's surface. It felt almost like you'd expect a paint-covered canvas to feel, except for one thing. It was warm to the touch. Body heat warm. I pulled my hand away slowly and looked at the picture again, at the blood-like smears desecrating the room, at the sinister figure that seemed to be posing for the portrait. I pulled the bottom of the painting away from the wall, and it swung free as easily as a heavy painting can. There was nothing strange on the back, no circuitry or weird eldritch diagrams. "Honey?" came Carmen's voice from the top of the stairs. "What are you doing?" "Carmen," look at my voice stuttered to a stop as I pointed to the painting. It now showed a portrait of the house, just as it always had. "Look at what?" "This." "Just I." My thoughts swirled, tripping over each other as I tried to make sense of the impossible. I touched the painting again, convincing myself that it was really there, and noticed that it was now cool to the touch. "Come to bed, honey, and turn the lights off," said Carmen, retreating to the master bedroom. I stared at the painting for a minute longer before switching off the lights and returning upstairs myself, my midnight snack forgotten. If I'm being honest, I had no real desire to go into the kitchen just then anyway. If this had been an isolated incident, I would have written it off as some sort of strange hallucination or dream, but I began to see other images in the painting with frightening regularity. Always bloody, always horrible, and never when anybody else was around. I saw the staircase awash in blood, limbs piled at the bottom. I saw flames from the fireplace licking across the wooden floor, the thick black smoke pouring from it nearly obscuring the bodies jammed within. I saw my children's bedrooms cut apart, the beds piled so high with slashed stuffing that only the deep, sticky redness suggested that they had not been empty when the work began. I saw my family murdered over and over again, slaughtered in countless horrifyingly inventive ways. And always, in every picture, stood the man in the pinstripe suit, his face deeply shadowed, his teeth gleaming white in a mocking leer. Any time I tried to draw anyone else's attention to it, the painting snapped back to a portrait of the house. Photographs I took showed only the original oil painting, the house standing proud against a blue sky. In fact, I found that if I looked at the painting through the viewfinder of a camera, it would display the portrait of the house even if I could see the canvas showing a blood-soaked interior with my own eyes. Somehow, this portrait had chosen to reveal itself only to me. I tried to convince my family to leave, of course, but with no evidence, what could I say? To everyone else, the house was idyllic, and there was no sign that anything the painting showed was in any danger of coming true. I'd installed locks, alarm systems, security cameras, and nothing showed anything out of the ordinary. I wasn't willing to tell them that I was scared because I constantly saw brutal deaths in an oil painting. That sort of sentence is how you get locked up. I took the painting down, thinking that if I didn't have to see it, that would solve the problem. I stashed it in the cloakroom, closed the door, and walked back into the great room only to see it hanging on the wall above the fireplace, just like always. I ran back to the cloakroom, but it was empty. No one besides me was in the house. I removed the painting twice more, once even going so far as to drive a nail through its frame to pin it to the wall in the cloakroom. I backed out, keeping it in my line of sight as long as I could before I spun around and sprinted for the great room. There the painting hung, just as always, its frame pristine and undamaged. I set up a camera after that and tried once more. I took the painting from the wall and flung it over my head, hearing it clatter on the floor. I kept my eyes fixed on the bare spot on the wall and even reached out to touch it, feeling the rough bricks beneath my fingers. But when I turned to look, no painting lay on the floor. and as soon as I turned my head back, I found myself with my nose nearly against the painting, hanging in its standard place, with a pinstriped man's bone-white smile leering down at me. The camera showed everything happening just as it had occurred, except that the painting never left the wall and never changed. I walked to it, placed my hands on the frame, then released it and threw my empty hands over my head. I touched the wall next to it, turned away, then stumbled back in fright as I turned back. Through it all, the portrait of the house hung there, unmoving. I told myself that I could just live with it, that I could learn to ignore it. But day by day, the images grew more violent, more grotesque. The man in the pinstripe suit seemed almost to be putting on a show for me, finding out what would most shock and disgust me. The harder I tried to ignore it, the worse the pictures got, taunting me, challenging me to pretend everything was normal. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Yesterday, the picture showed my own face flayed open, the eyelids cut away, every muscle displayed. The look on my face made it clear that I was screaming, and the knife in the pinstriped man's hand made it clear that he was far from done. Carmen knew I wasn't happy here, even if she didn't understand why. If I presented her with a new location already picked out, with a family ready to make an offer on this house, she would go along with it. And if not, I would talk her into it. I contacted a realtor today, emailed him pictures of the house. He wrote back gushing about the vaulted ceilings, the hardwood floors, the expansive views. He also wrote, "Is that an oil portrait of your house? I just can't get past that. It's so wonderful. Does that convey? It would be a great selling point. You can have it, for all I care," I sent. "It's a gift, freely given." He asked, "Sure, enjoy." His response email was reasonable enough. "Thanks," it said. "I'll be over later. I can't wait to see the house in person." There was a file attached, but I figured it was paperwork or something, and I didn't open it immediately. When I finally did, a freezing shock ripped through my body, a ripple of pure terror. The picture is taken from a phone's camera in selfie mode. The man holding it is wearing a pinstripe suit, with a hat casting his face into shadow. And although he's restraining his grin in the photo, I know exactly how white his teeth will be when he stretches that small smile into a leer. Story 2. 8 months ago, my life changed forever. I couldn't tell you what the weather was like that day, what I had for breakfast, or even the first song I heard on the radio before I left the house. In fact, I can't honestly remember any details of that day before I found a quiet little arcade downtown that I'd somehow never noticed before. I can't even remember the name of it. On a whim, I ducked into the place and had a look around. At first glance, it looked like a normal arcade, a moment frozen in time with the ability to transport you back to the gaming days of yore. I spent a lot of time in arcades back in the early 80s with my dad. It was about the only passion we shared together, and one of the only safe activities we could truly enjoy given my condition. I suffer from something called cleidocranial dysplasia. I'm not going to waste your time or mine doing a deep dive into what that is. You have the internet just like I do. Basically, I'm way shorter than everyone I know, my bones are brittle, my spine is all messed up, and I've had dentures from an early age. I don't mean to be crass or offend anyone else with the disease. I'm just sick to death of having to explain it to people, so I've learned to stick to the highlights. I'd say my biggest obsession at the arcades were the pinball machines. I'd spend hours in front of them every day after school studying patterns and perfecting the perfect angle on the ball from the flippers that would hit the chutes I needed for the best score possible. Once I mastered the machines at one arcade, Dad would find us another and we'd start all over again. Some combination of the lights, the music, and the geometry entranced me. There are times I'd start playing and just completely space out until I ran out of quarters or it was time to go home. Even after Dad passed, I kept up the hobby. Partially to always stay close to him in some odd way, but mostly because no matter what changed in my life, pinball machines stayed the same. They were a source of comfort and zen, which is a rare thing in life these days especially. It didn't take long until I found the corner where the pinball machines were kept. One after the other were my favorite fur machines of all time, the ones that had taken me the longest to master as a child and often brought me the most comfort. There was Theater of Magic with its sultry sorceress gesturing me closer with an outstretched palm. Monster Bash with its motley crew of musical monsters inviting me to rock. The Twilight Zone luring me into a middle ground between light and shadow. And finally, there stood medieval madness calling upon me to save an ancient kingdom. I pulled a couple quarters out of my pocket and headed for Theater of Magic. An impromptu date with the first woman I'd ever fantasized about as a kid sounded like the perfect way to kill some time. Hey, don't judge me, man. At least it wasn't the succubus from the original Dungeons and Dragons monster manual. Just before I slid the silver in her slot, I saw something out of the corner of my left eye that I hadn't seen initially. Positioned into a corner was a pinball machine I'd never seen before, which was odd because there wasn't one in existence I'd never played. I'd even taken vacations to other countries just to play new or rare machines. The machine was called Madame Marilyn's Occult Pinball. On the back glass was a window with a functional little female fortune teller inside of it. Mechanical inserts into pinball machines were nothing new, of course, but they were always a treat to behold. With my mind made up, I slipped my silver in the slot and tossed my extra quarters on the apron. I pulled back the plunger, took a deep breath, and released it. As my ball was launched to the center of the playfield, the song Pinball Wizard by The Who. I laughed so hard that I wasn't paying attention and my ball hit the drain. Normally, I'd be pissed to lose the first ball so quickly, but this machine had an autosave, so the ball was sent back to the plunger instead. I hit the change machine a time or two and probably went through $20 in quarters easily before really getting the hang of the game. If you've played pinball before, I don't need to explain in any real detail how they work. You hit bumpers, knock down drop targets, ride the subways and habit trails, and pay attention to the special mission, all while avoiding the drain and gobble holes. If you've never played one before, I'd have to question what you've been doing with your life. This machine had more missions than I'd seen in a pinball machine before in my life. The skill shots alone had me sweating so hard I'd misaimed more than I'd care to admit. I'd been there from morning till sundown by the time I'd finally hit the wizard level of the machine. Not all machines had them, of course, but it was always a pleasant surprise when they did. A wizard level in a pinball machine was akin to a secret final stage in a normal video game, but a million times more difficult. To beat any wizard level of a machine put you in a league all your own. I'd beaten them all, and I would be damned if I didn't beat this one too. It took me an extra 30 minutes of the most anxiety-inducing game of my life before I beat it. I was in the zone, becoming one with the machine when it happened. The music started to glitch and turn to static. The lights flickered in a strange entrancing pattern, and the mechanical fortune teller built in the back glass began to move. A sultry voice came through the speakers over the static. "Congratulations, Jerry, you have bested me. I shall now grant thee thy heart's desire." To say I was stunned is an understatement. I know what you're thinking. How does this machine know my name, right? Yeah, that thought occurred to me in the moment too. I'm old enough to have seen every movie you can think of that should have told me right then and there it was time to get the hell out of Dodge. On the other hand, I've always been a curious kind of guy. In the end, I blurted out the first thing that came to my mind, really. Honestly, it was more of a nervous joke, but how many times would I get to relive one of my favorite cinematic moments right? "I want to be big," I shouted out, probably a little too loudly. It was a line from my favorite Tom Hanks movie, and it felt super relevant in the moment. "Your wish will be granted," Madame Marilyn replied profoundly. Madame Marilyn reset itself, and my name popped up in the top position of the scoreboard, replacing someone by the name of Arthur. Some kid probably, but I didn't really care to dwell on it. I went home and passed out, dead to the world. When I woke up, it was still dark outside. Every inch of my body was throbbing in pain. It took me the better part of 10 minutes just to sit up in bed and turn my lamp on. I was met with the most terrifying image I'd ever witnessed. My bones appeared to be somehow lengthening before my eyes, grotesquely stretching my skin in all directions. I screamed out in pain but didn't move out of fear that I would split myself wide open. Joints shifted and popped as every part of me was dislocated and shifted to a new position. Outside of a werewolf movie, this just wasn't possible. I could feel my organs moving around inside, suddenly untethered from their previous locations. Vomit and bile didn't eject from my mouth as much as it just sort of oozed out in sticky strings. My vision blurred completely, and the sutures of my skull began to pulse wildly. I passed out from the pain when I felt a quadricep muscle snap like a guitar string that had been wound too tight. When I awoke once more, I flinched at the bright fluorescent hospital lights. According to my nurse, I'd been out for nearly a week. She assured me that they had done everything possible to help me, but there was only so much they could do with what was left. In my drugged-up confusion, I had no idea what she meant at first, at least until she brought in a mirror to show me my reflection. My initial reaction was to laugh. I'd seen trick mirrors like this at the Halloween stores in years past that showed you some horrible monster with your face on it. A quick glance at the nurse's horrified visage knocked that thought out of my brain, and I began sobbing inconsolably. What looked back at me from the mirror was some fucked up cross between Frankenstein's monster and the guy that got turned into the walrus in that movie Tusk. My flesh had more stitching and staples than a local craft store. My lower torso was gone for the most part, and large portions of my upper torso looked more like mangled corpse parts than my own. That was 8 months ago. This is the first time I've told anyone what happened that day. Until now, everyone thought it was a home invasion gone wrong. It was a leading police theory that I just went with at some point, because who would honestly believe the truth at this point? What weirds me out is that out of every part I lost or got put back together, my fingers were mostly untouched. A little longer, sure, but they were the only things that didn't have to be somewhat rebuilt and reattached or discarded altogether like other things were. On the bright side, I can still play pinball for the most part. My insurance covered one of those electric lift wheel chairs so I can adjust my height if needed. I've been playing more than usual this last month. I hear there's a big tournament a couple of towns over at some place called the Corpus Arcade. Story 3. My friends Kev and Nat were about to celebrate their 14th anniversary and wanted it to be something special, so after a few months of indecision, I made the suggestion they renew their vows. We've done that before though. Kev told me. But have you done it at the spot where you proposed? I asked. I hadn't thought of that, he admitted. I asked him where he popped the question, and he said it was at an old Victorian-style house that was used as a tourist trap. He said Nat always had a thing for old houses and that time period, so he took her to the balcony and got down on one knee. Sounds like a trip down memory lane would be perfect. I told him, but after a Google search, we found that it was now apparently abandoned. The previous owner had died due to COVID, and no one had bothered to make sure that the property remained open. I guess that's off the table, Kev said. I told him not to be so hasty and did a little bit of digging. A few phone calls later, I discovered that the house was still apparently for sale. Think of how romantic that would be. You buy the house where you propose and then manage to renew your vows there as well. I don't have that kind of money. I hated to admit that the price was rather steep, but I didn't want him to be discouraged, so I suggested I spread the word to their family and friends. I don't like handouts either, Kyle, you know that, Kev muttered. But I knew that their financial situation was because they could hardly make ends meet, and both of them were not going to ask for help, so I nodded and claimed I wouldn't interfere, and then made those calls the moment he left. A friend in South Florida suggested that we create a GoFund. It worked when I had to get my dog's surgery. It was insane that so many people showed such support, he told me. But I worried something like that would be easily traceable. If this is going to be a surprise, it needs to be the kind that their reaction will be timeless. Nat's boss was supposed to give me a call back that afternoon with some ideas, but never got around to it. I know that he has been handling a lot of issues lately, so I didn't pry and just kept on plugging to find the solution. It was actually my wife that had the suggestion that made my jaw drop. We could get it. I mean, I just got that settlement, remember. It won't exactly hurt us. It's not that much, she said. I haven't even really brought that up to anyone, I told her. All the more to surprise them, and we could use it as a summer rental or something. Or a timeshare or whatever, she said. We had already made quite a few big investments with the money, and I was hesitant to blow more of it. But after reviewing our budget, I realized that she was right, and so I made the call. The phone only rang one time surprisingly, and I got a voice that sounded raspy and a bit confused. Can I help you? And when I told them I was interested in buying the property, they were genuinely shocked and even double-checked. You do know that some people claim it needs to be torn down. The owner said, "Look, if we want to sell it later, that's our prerogative. Do you want the money or what?" I asked. Honestly, I was having some doubts, but I knew I had to do something fast because Kev and Nat's anniversary was only a few weeks away. Is this something we can do over the phone, by the way? I have work, so I can't drop everything and come down there. The owner was flustered, but worked through everything. We contacted a local bank and had a conference call where they emailed me all the proper forms. It honestly took less than a few hours, but it felt like forever. You will get the deed in the mail in about 10 business days. I checked the calendar and realized it would take too long to surprise them, so I insisted that the deed go directly to them and to have their names on it. Mr. Harrison, do you recognize that this means you would be giving them the property you just bought? The lawyer asked. I knew this didn't align with what my wife wanted at first, but I was so scared of losing this chance, I said, to go through with it. And the sale was finalized a short moment later. Thankfully, due to my business background, I managed to drop the price considerably, especially because I recognized that they were actually desperate to sell it. The market is bad down there due to the constant hurricanes, and from what I understand, right around the time it closed, there was some kind of incident. I told my wife. She wasn't entirely happy that we lost an investment, but was pleased when she learned we saved money. And Kev and Nat were shocked, to say the least, when that title made it to them. Well, technically she was the only one that knew, so I told her to make the dream of the renewed vows come true. It was something they both really wanted. This is the best gift ever, Kyle. I don't know how to repay you. She squealed. I told her that seeing pictures and those smiles when they returned was enough for me, and I ended the phone call with a happy anniversary. Then a week passed by and I knew they were headed to the property. Then 2 weeks passed by and I tried to call to see how things had gone. I normally talk to Nat almost every other day on Messenger, so this was an unusual bit of silence. I went on Facebook and saw that they had already posted pictures of themselves at the building. They had dressed up for the occasion, and I was pleased to see Kev had even gotten a new ring for the big event. I tried to call and tease them for not keeping us in the loop about the whole thing, but it kept going to voicemail. After another few weeks of radio silence, I was beginning to get irritated, so I contacted one of her friends out of state. You mean she hasn't called you either? Not at all. Mel said with a tinge of dread in her throat. I soon found out that no one had heard from them since they had gone on their trip. My concern has now tripled and I desperately wanted to be sure they were safe. My wife said I was making a mountain out of a molehill, but I insisted that the next time we had a long break, in about a week, we would need to go. Seems a waste of a vacation. They probably are just busy, but I knew this wasn't normal behavior. Something was off and something was telling me I needed to discover what. The break came and I wound up traveling alone. My wife had become sick and had to be quarantined. As much as I wanted to care for her, I knew that I had to resolve what had happened. Arriving in Florida, I immediately checked their address first to confirm my suspicion. A new family was staying there, and the man said they had only been there for about 6 weeks, which lined up perfectly for the trip Kev and Nat had taken. My heart was beginning to beat faster as I facetimed Mel and told her what my search had found so far. I think something bad happened at that old tourist trap. She agreed with me. I had no other choice but to go there and find out for myself. It was a 2-hour drive, and I checked in with my wife to tell her that we were right to be worried. She warned me to be cautious. but I'm not sure I would have listened. My desire for answers outweighed the danger. As my Uber driver pulled up to the site, I found myself taken aback and confused. "This is the spot?" I asked as I stepped out and looked at the dilapidated manor. It was but a hollow shell of all the glamorous pictures I had seen online. "The place hasn't been used in ages, mate. You sure you want me to drop you here?" I confirmed it, but told him to keep the engine running as I walked toward the iron fence. It struck me as bizarre to imagine my friends would dare step foot in such an ancient building. It would likely collapse on them in a moment's notice, I thought as my shoes crunched the dead grass. It had a ghastly vibe to it, and despite the loneliness, I had an uneasy feeling I was being watched. That grew to a thunderous noise as I stepped into the foyer, cobwebs and dust covering every inch of the abandoned house. Kev and Nat wouldn't have even attempted to stay here or explore, I thought as I second-guessed my arrival. Then behind me, the door to the house slammed on its own, and I heard a strange laughter from the second floor. It made the hairs on my neck stand on edge. There was someone else here. Carefully, I went up the steps using my smartphone as a light as I called out. But no voice responded. I did hear soft music play though, urging me to move toward its source. It sounded like their song, Elvis Presley. I can't help falling in love. It was coming from one of the balconies, and as I approached it, I once again was at a loss for words. There were silhouettes there, dark and fearsome, but also familiar. My friends. But they were not there in the flesh. I pulled back a canopy of webs to see that it was just a mirage, my eyes playing tricks on me. Or perhaps something grander and more haunting than I cared to admit. I began to explore and noticed other signs of their presence. A dress on one of the beds matching what Kev said she had worn on their date, and a portrait of them in the main library. When I saw it, it made me feel wonder and fright. How could it be here, and what was it trying to tell me? In the picture, Kev was proposing just as he said that he did, the beginning of their love story. And then as I watched, like a magical slideshow, the picture changed. It showed how they grew and changed as a couple over the years, through arguments and good times, laughter and heartbreak, always by each other's side. Then it returned to them coming to this house again. The cycle was complete. Their eyes were now on me. They were saying thanks for bringing them back here. I listened as they began to recite their vows to one another. It was a lovely sentiment that is too private and powerful to recount here. But the house was transforming around me as they talked, returning to its splendor. It had drawn them in and made them fall in love, and now, as a parting gift, I understood the house was allowing them to renew that love, to relive that life they had. It was a beautiful life to have, to relearn love over and always be happy and never worrying about what the next tomorrow would bring. A perfect renewal of their story. The picture returned to its original pose and the house faded into its dark and abandoned state again, and I realized it was time for me to go. My friends weren't as trapped as I had thought. They had come to do exactly as they intended, and the forces that were at work here offered a gift. I envied this cycle of love they now got to experience, and I closed the gate and bid them goodbye. I can still hear them reciting those vows and getting the chance to experience all of those memories again. It makes me hopeful for all the couples out there that are struggling to find their own new love again. Maybe we all can get the chance to be ghosts one day, blinding each other radiantly. Or maybe they are the lucky ones. Here's to both of those happy endings and happy hauntings. Story 4. I could smell the stench of death before I even stepped out of my truck. In its glory days, this place was the jewel of the neighborhood, the American dream personified. A sprawling 2-story, 3-bedroom house only a few miles from the beach. Looking at it now, you would hardly have guessed that anyone lived there at all. It was an eyesore even from the driveway, clusters of discarded papers and trash of all variety as far as you can see. None of the items seemed to have any rhyme or reason, but that was to be expected given who the owner was. Working for the city for the past 10 years, the name Miguel Tindalos has come up at least a few times a year. He was a foreigner, had inherited a large sum of money from family, and bought out most of the property in the surrounding neighborhood. At first, most thought it was a sign of new blood in the area, but it quickly became apparent Miguel was going to be more of a problem than a solution. He was a hoarder, plain and simple. Everything he bought he kept, and while he spent a lot of money, most of the items he owned were now sitting in his front yard collecting dust. And I knew the inside was no better. Most of the surrounding community constantly complained about the animals, the smell, and the sheer amounts of trash. But Miguel had deep pockets and could pay any fine that was thrown his way. Some threatened to get the city to condemn his house, but that fell through too. As a result, the hoarder's house had become a fixture on the end of the lane for as long as I could remember. As I stepped out to approach the house, I tried to recall the last time I had actually seen Mr. Tindalos in person. It had been a while. Everyone knew he was a hermit. The clutter kept him hidden from the world. I always wondered what it was he felt he was hiding from, and I guess now that I was here to assess the mess and find his body, it was time I found out. How long had he been dead in this filth before anyone thought to check on him? I knew he had no family, no friends save maybe a few debt collectors. His mailbox was stuffed full, possibly with months of suspension notices and other bills. He could have been rotting away for a year and no one would be the wiser. It made me dread what was to come. As much as I wanted to delay the inevitable, I knew that getting this over with would be for the best, so I got my hazmat suit on and headed for the door. The air felt stiff despite the season. Not a soul was nearby. Most of the other people had moved away to get as far from Miguel as possible. He had driven down the property values, and if it hadn't been for the recent storm, I doubted anyone would have realized that the house was still here at all. The water had washed so much of his trash down the road it was imperative that the city clean it, just for the safety and well-being of others in the area. But now, standing here, about to pry the door open to a living cesspool, I realized that I was likely going to walk into something far worse than I had imagined. As soon as the latch unlocked, more trash of every sort fell out. There were wrappers, bottles, discarded food, and all sorts of miscellaneous stuff. It was difficult to even be sure what was worth salvaging, if anything, and I had hardly even stepped inside. I had to crawl over the first layer of trash to get into the front room, where more garage and clutter of every sort packed out the entire space. There were boxes dated as though meant for a move, perhaps from when Miguel first moved in, that had never been opened, crammed into corners. There were also bags of trash, tossed aside to any available space that wasn't already piled high. Besides the usual trash, I saw milk jugs that had either fermented or been filled with urine, a clear indication that water hadn't been used in the house for some time. And that didn't even account for the rat feces and other droppings I could easily spot everywhere. It was horrifying to behold the sheer carnage and chaos of how this man had lived. I had to push aside cobwebs and trash to crawl toward the kitchen, the roof above me clearly sagging from the weight of more junk in the rooms above. Every crevice of this place was a pigsty, every alcove taken over by more items. Some were antiques that clearly could have been sold, or canned food that could have gone to charity, but the sheer amount of droppings and mold made it obvious that there wouldn't be much here to save. I made it to the kitchen and inspected the food. Even in the suit, I could tell that the majority of it had gone bad. Rotting or molding fruit was stuffed into every part of the fridge, and dirty dishes piled high on the counters. Then I heard a rustling noise from somewhere above me and felt my heart skip a beat. Could it be that somehow Mr. Tindalos had managed to remain alive? It seemed like an impossibility, but I had to be sure. I closed the fridge back and made for the stairs. There was even more debris here, along with larger feces droppings that looked like they either came from a large animal or Miguel himself. It made me want to vomit as I slowly climbed the stairs and called out his name. I didn't want to hold out hope that he was still alive, but if so, I had to at least try to help him out of this nightmare. As I stood at the top of the stairs, my eyes drifted toward the bathroom. I wasn't sure I was ready to face how nasty that was, but I knew I needed to check it since it was the closest. Pushing the door open, I was fixated on the pile of human feces that was dredged on the toilet, along with the massive amounts of what looked like shredded skin on the floor. It was nauseating and disturbing to think that any human would subject themselves to this. At the back of the door, on a hook, I saw what looked like some kind of costume, wrinkled and completely yellowed by mold and time itself. In a previous age, it might have even looked like a bodysuit of some kind, I thought as I pulled back the shower curtain to see more caked mold and feces covering every part of the tub. There was also blood and what looked like a woman's head fused to the shower where the water would pour out of her eye sockets. I quickly backed out and slammed the door, my own head dizzy, as I tried to come to terms with what I had just seen. This was beyond revolting. I had seen a lot of terrible things in my day, but nothing like this. I wanted to leave immediately, call the cops, maybe even throw up. Miguel Tindalos was some kind of serial killer. It all made sense to me as I stumbled down the hall, trying not to trip over the other debris. All the reports of people going missing in the area. They had become part of his horde. I was now looking at the shredded and flaky skin on the floor and wondering how many victims were actually buried under this filth. Somehow, instead of finding a way out, I was in a different room and I was immediately confused. Had this room been here before? The hallways and clutter made the house feel confusing and labyrinthine. As the door pushed open, I saw to my utter bewilderment that inside it was pristine, as though a line had been drawn in the sand to distinguish that this area was different than the rest of the house. As my vision recovered, I realized there were candles neatly arranged around a draped piece of furniture at the end of the room. The setup reminded me of how an altar might appear at a shrine, unsettling me even more. I felt compelled to pull back the cloth and see what was underneath. It was a large vanity mirror, the kind of which might normally hang in a master bedroom. Yet instead of being made of normal clear glass, the material of the mirror was the darkest shade I had ever seen. I tried to think of the name for it, and I think the closest description is Vantablack. It was uncanny to behold. As long as you might stare into it, nothing would ever reflect back. I reached out instinctively to touch the mirror, mesmerized by its presence. Then I felt a chill in the air. Had the candles been lit when I entered the room? The mirror seemed to move of its own accord, and then I realized it was the glass sliding out of the frame the way that sludge might from a broken pipe. It was a living slime that was moving toward me, and from that sludge I saw what looked like fingers protruding. I fell backward out of the room and toward the hallway, pushing clutter aside. I think I literally shouted out, "Fuck this shit," as I began to run, but the horde was all around me. I knew that a creature with no bones would find it far easier to traverse the area than me. I could hardly catch my breath, and then, in my shattered brain, I thought of the window in the bathroom. I could climb out. I pushed open the door, climbing atop the feces-covered toilet as my heart pounded faster. The slime was right behind me. It swirled and moved toward the tub as though attracted by the body parts. I couldn't help but be paralyzed in fear as I pushed the window latch to the roof open and watched the slime consume the costume on the wall. As it took the form of the bodysuit, I realized that the entire thing was, in fact, made of peeled and wrinkled human skin worn out from age and extensive wear and tear. It was mortifying to watch, but I couldn't look away as it picked up the severed head, pulsing and oozing in and out of the empty sockets and holes as it seemed to take it as a mask on its misshapen body. Then I heard this ghastly scream. It sounded like it was trying to imitate the woman that it had taken as a body as I pushed onto the roof. I'm not quite sure. I couldn't stop from running as I fell out onto the hard tiling and looked toward the backyard. There looked to be literally hundreds of bags of trash filled with leftover food, discarded items, and possibly even more disgusting stuff, but I didn't care. My life depended on the fact that I needed to keep moving. I leapt into the trash below and swam through the putrid clutter, pushing my way to safety to avoid the ungodly creature that followed. I made it to my truck and drove away as fast as I could, not even bothering to stop and unzip my hazmat suit. I stopped and took a few breaths to clear my head. The house needed to be demolished immediately, destroyed before any other poor souls became a part of that clusterfuck. I had a few spare packs of cigarettes in the truck and a gallon of gas. Turning around, I forced myself to return, hands gripping the wheel of my vehicle as I came up to the house. I got out and started to douse the trash with the gasoline, determined to end this nightmare before anyone else had to come across it. I could hear the creature scream as I lit a cigarette and tossed it into the pile, shielding my eyes as the inferno began to rise. I felt the heat swarm around my body as I stepped away, my feet feeling heavy as I felt the flames lick my skin. Something sparked from the trash heap, colliding with my eye, and I screamed, desperate to see again. I ran from the house and called 911 as the fire kept consuming the horde. Later that day, I had to have emergency surgery, my eye removed due to retinal scarring. I returned to the hoarder house the day I was discharged to be sure the inferno had done its job. But it felt like the trash heap had doubled in size and spread even farther. As I looked at the desolate structure, I wondered to myself if part of me was now left behind in this place, to become part of the horde. I have recommended to the city that we simply leave the property alone. I hope they listen. Story 5. I cannot share all the details of what happened on March 3, 2018. As a doctor, I'm not allowed to share certain private details, so names have been changed, and I do not mention what hospital I worked at the time. There has to be some sort of logical explanation as to what happened. So far, I haven't come up with any. Here are my notes I took that night. 3 people are dead because of that woman's presence, and I need to find a reason why so I can continue going on with life. Everything has to have a rational reason, or so I thought. 6:29 p.m. Jane Doe was brought in about 10 minutes prior. Age is somewhere in her early 20s. She would be quite tall when standing, almost 6'2". She's African American with 2 mirror injuries between her shoulder blades. The skin has been taken clean off and seems to be done expertly. I believe someone may have been trying to skin her, possibly to hide an identifying mark like a tattoo. Jane Doe was found walking naked down a street in a daze. She was found by 2 young women who took her immediately to the emergency room. By the time they reached it, Jane was unconscious and unresponsive. I hold high hopes for her recovery, as other than the injuries on her back, she seems to be perfectly healthy. 7:01 p.m. had to calm down Derek Peterson again. Peterson woke up screaming about demons and had to be given a sedative. He really needs a transfer to a proper mental ward, but his parents only want him to be treated for his injuries before he's sent home, like this time and every other time. 8:09 p.m. Jane Doe has awoken. She seems to be all right in mind, but claims to not remember who she is and what happened to her. I have reason to believe she's lying, but it appears she's gone through some form of trauma, and I don't believe she's ready to relive it. I've ordered a rape kit, but she doesn't appear to show the typical signs of sexual assault other than being found nude. The storm is picking up. I'm going to get a migraine from this. 8:38 p.m. Jane Doe somehow escaped from her room and ended up in the room of Agnes Church. She was sitting by the elderly woman and stroking her hand, almost comfortingly. I managed to guide Jane back to her room and apologize to Agnes, but Agnes had already fallen back asleep. I imagine that's really all that's left for her, sleep. Jane has been put back in her room, and I've assigned a nurse to her door. We can't have her wandering around the hospital. She could hurt herself. 8:55 p.m. Agnes passed away not 5 minutes ago. I cannot seem to shake off this odd chill about the uncanny timing of her meeting Jane and her death, but it is circumstantial. Agnes hasn't been right for days. I knew her end was coming soon. I'll miss playing board games with her on the weekends. If there's a heaven, she's likely playing Yahtzee with the angels now and somehow winning every time, even if it is a luck game. 9:23 p.m. Jane got out of her room again. The nurse left to use the bathroom, and by the time she got back, Jane was gone. Because she was in my office. She's incredibly sweet. All she wanted to tell me was that she remembered her name, Leah. I'm not the kind of man to get so captivated with his patients, but something about Leah tugs at my heart. I suppose she reminds me of my sister before the cancer weakened her spirit. I took Leah back to her room and told her that she shouldn't leave until we can find someone she knows. She seemed mildly agitated with this, but she did not object. 10:40 p.m. Derek passed away. This shouldn't have happened. One moment he was enjoying TV while chattering the ear off of the nurse who was checking his bandages when, as she describes, his eyes rolled back in his skull and he fell backward, choking and thrashing about. We tried to save him, but he was gone within minutes. It was like his body just ceased. I'm going over his treatment, but he wasn't allergic to any of the medications we gave him, and other than his mental disorders, he was perfectly healthy. Leah tried to get out during the chaos, but I managed to catch her before she left her wing. She said she wanted outside for a breath of fresh air, but I have no doubt if she leaves this hospital, we will never see her again. We're still trying to get a positive hit on her. There are no girls in the area matching her description with the name Leah who have been reported missing. We might have to widen our search. The storm's only getting worse. I think there's something wrong with the air because I've had no less than 2 bloody noses tonight, and my head is pounding. 11:01 p.m. once again, Leah tried to escape. She's begged to be released and claims she remembers how to get home, but she cannot name an address nor any relatives who can pick her up. She still doesn't remember her own surname. The police here now are trying to ID her. I just got word. She escaped again. 11:30 p.m. Leah was found attempting to get to the roof. She claims that's the way home. We've now had to restrain her to the bed as she is now classified as a suicide risk. Officer Matthew Reynolds said she had taken off her hospital gown and was about to jump when he tackled her. I'm thankful she didn't succeed with her attempt to kill herself, but I'm worried she'd try again. 11:45 p.m. Reynolds is dead. He just dropped in the hallway, just like Derek. I have an unsettling feeling that Leah may be connected to this. 12:01 a.m. the power was knocked out by the storm. We're running off of generators now. The lights are constantly flickering. 2 nurses have fainted, thankfully not dead, but both experiencing bloody noses and migraines. I can feel my own head start to pound. I swear there's blood pattering against the window, but that's impossible. I might need to go home, or go to the emergency room. 12:33 a.m. birds are flying into the windows. Like drawn to a beacon, they're flying to the building, smacking against the glass and falling to the ground dead. The sound certainly isn't helping my head. I need to talk to Leah, but I believe she's asleep and is under guard by 2 officers. It's foolish to believe that this girl could be causing such madness, but I don't know what else to think. 12:45 a.m. the officers have fallen unconscious and Leah is nowhere to be found. I'm checking the roof now. 1:12 a.m. LI go any. SE fled WI. 8:31 a.m. I was found on the roof unconscious shortly after I wrote that nonsense message in my notes. My face was apparently covered in blood and they thought I might be dead, but I survived the experience. Whatever that experience was. I must have hallucinated everything, but I shall take note of it anyway. I found Leah standing on the edge of the roof, once again nude and staring at the sky. She turned to look at me. "Will you stop me?" Her voice was hollow. Tired. Lightning flashed, and I swore I saw something on her back, illuminated by the lightning. I tried to talk her down, show her there's a better way, but she shook her head. I have to try to get home, doctor. This is the only way to see if I can still fly. She jumped then. I ran to the edge of the roof and peered over the ledge. I saw Leah's body on the ground, but I saw her also stand, brush herself off like she'd suffered a minor fall. She looked up at me, and I became overwhelmed with grief. I wept. I cried as she raised her head to the sky and screamed at the top of her lungs. The sound of loss, the sound of heartbreak. I must have passed out then because that's all I remember. Thankfully, I seem no worse for wear and will likely return to work in a few days. Leah is missing, but there is no sign of her body either. I think she's going to spend the rest of eternity trying to find a way home.